When Barron Trump quietly paid for a stranger's meal in a crowded diner, no one expected what would happen next. The ripple effect of that simple act left everyone watching in tears. The diner was a cozy little spot, tucked away on a quiet street corner, its neon sign flickering faintly in the evening glow. Inside, the warm yellow lights bathed everything in a soft, welcoming hue. The air was filled with the comforting aroma of grilled burgers, sizzling bacon, and freshly brewed coffee, mingled with the occasional waft of something sweet, like pie fresh out of the oven. The sound of plates clinking and forks scraping against ceramic mixed with the low hum of conversation. A small jukebox in the corner played a familiar old tune, barely audible over the steady rhythm of life unfolding in the diner. People sat at booths and tables, lost in their own little worlds, some chatting softly, others staring into their coffee cups, and a few scrolling through their phones. Near the window, Barron Trump sat quietly at a small table, dressed in a plain hoodie and jeans. He blended in easily, his tall frame slightly hunched over as he stirred the sugar into his tea. His demeanor was calm, almost thoughtful, as if he was taking everything in without saying much. Across the room, a man sat alone at a corner booth. His coat was patched and frayed, and his hands were rough, the kind that spoke of hard work and tougher times. He looked down at the menu, scanning it with furrowed brows, and then carefully folded it and placed it aside, as though deciding against ordering. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with a warm but tired smile, moved gracefully between the tables, her apron swinging slightly with each step. She approached the man with a kind word, but he waved her off politely, signaling that he wouldn't be ordering tonight. She nodded, her face softening with understanding, and went back to the counter. It was a quiet, unassuming moment, but Barron noticed it. His gaze lingered on the man for a moment longer, his expression thoughtful. The man's quiet struggle seemed to strike a chord, setting something into motion that no one else in the room could have predicted. The scene was set. A bustling diner, a stranger in need, and a quiet observer ready to act. What happened next would touch the lives of everyone in that room. The man in the corner booth shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands resting on the edge of the table as if they were holding him steady. His eyes wandered over the room, briefly meeting the glances of other diners before darting away. It was clear he was trying to go unnoticed, to disappear into the background. Barron Trump, sitting just a few tables away, couldn't help but notice him. It wasn't the man's appearance that caught his attention. It was the way he carried himself. There was a quiet weight about him, like he was carrying something heavy, though nothing was visible on his shoulders. Barron glanced down at his own tea, stirring it absently, as he kept the man in the corner of his vision. The waitress approached the man again, holding a small notepad. "Anything I can get for you, hun?" she asked, kindly, her voice soft enough not to draw attention from the rest of the room. The man hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of the napkin in front of him. "Just a glass of water, if that's okay," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't meet her eyes, instead focusing on the napkin as though it held the answer to something unspoken. The waitress nodded, her smile never faltering. "Of course, let me know if you change your mind." As she walked away, the man let out a quiet sigh, his shoulders slumping slightly. He leaned back in his seat, his gaze falling on the menu he'd pushed aside earlier. Barron could see the faint tension in his jaw, the kind that came from wrestling with decisions too big to solve over dinner. He'd seen it before, in people who were trying to figure out how to make it to tomorrow. Barron's eyes flicked back to his tea, his mind racing. It was such a small thing, a man sitting alone in a diner, not ordering food. But it wasn't hard to guess what might be going on. Maybe he didn't have enough money to spare. Maybe he was trying to stretch what little he had. Whatever the reason, it didn't sit right with Barron to let the moment pass. He glanced at the waitress, who was busy refilling coffee cups at another table. Then he looked back at the man, who now sat staring out the window, his expression distant. Barron took a deep breath, his decision made. Flagging down the waitress as she walked past, Barron leaned in and spoke quietly, his voice steady. "Can you bring him whatever he wants? I'll take care of it." The waitress paused, her eyes widening slightly as she processed his request. "You mean the man in the corner booth?" Barron nodded. "Yeah, just don't tell him it's from me." say it's taken care of." She hesitated, glancing between Barron and the man, then smiled softly. "That's very kind of you," she said, her voice low to keep the exchange private. "I'll make sure he knows he can order whatever he wants." Barron nodded again, his expression calm but resolute. As the waitress walked away, he leaned back in his seat, watching as the moment began to unfold. It wasn't about being noticed or recognized. It was about doing the right thing, even if no one else knew. Across the room, the man still sat unaware of what was happening, his fingers tracing invisible patterns on the table. For Barron, the simple gesture felt like the least he could do. Little did he know, this small act of kindness was about to lead to something far greater than he could have imagined. The waitress returned to the counter, her steps slower as she considered Barron's request. She stole a quick glance at the man in the corner booth, who was still staring out the window, oblivious to the attention he was drawing. After a moment, she filled a glass of water and approached him again, her notepad tucked under one arm. "Here's your water," she said with a warm smile, setting it down in front of him. Then, as casually as she could, she added, "Also, someone wanted to make sure you could get a meal tonight. It's all taken care of." The man froze, his hand hovering over the glass of water. He looked up at her, his brow furrowed in confusion. "I'm sorry, what?" She gestured to the menu, still sitting neatly folded on the table. "It's covered. Someone thought you might need a little help tonight." The man's mouth opened slightly as if to protest, but no words came out. He glanced around the diner, his eyes scanning the faces of the other patrons, but no one seemed to be looking his way. Barron, seated just a few tables away, kept his gaze on his tea, not giving away anything. I can't accept that," the man said finally, his voice cracking slightly. "I'm fine, really." The waitress shook her head gently. "It's already done," she said softly. "They just wanted you to have a good meal. No strings attached." The man's shoulders slumped, and for a moment he looked down at the menu as though it were the most foreign thing in the world. "I don't know what to say," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "No one's ever done something like this for me before." "You don't have to say anything," the waitress replied, her smile unwavering. "Just let me know what you'd like." He hesitated for a long moment, his fingers tracing the edge of the menu, before finally opening it. His hands trembled slightly as he scanned the options. "Maybe just a sandwich," he said quietly. "And a coffee." "Coming right up," the waitress said, her tone cheerful as she took the menu and walked back to the counter. But as she placed the order, she couldn't help but glance back at the man, who now sat with his head bowed, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He looked like he was holding back tears. At his table, Barron continued to observe quietly. He wasn't looking for recognition, but he couldn't help feeling a small sense of relief as the man finally placed an order. It was such a small thing, a sandwich and a coffee, but it seemed to mean the world to him. Barron's thoughts drifted as he considered how often people like this man went unnoticed, their struggles hidden behind quiet dignity. Across the diner, a few other patrons had started to notice what was happening. A young couple whispered to each other, their eyes flicking between the man and Barron. "Do you think it was him?" one of them asked softly, nodding toward Barron. The other shrugged, their expression curious but unsure. The waitress returned with the man's food, setting it down gently in front of him. "Enjoy," she said with a smile, before turning to tend to her other tables. The man stared at the plate for a long moment, as if he couldn't believe it was real. Then, slowly, he picked up the sandwich, his hand still trembling, and took a bite. The tension in his face seemed to melt away with that first bite. It wasn't just a sandwich. It was a lifeline, a reminder that someone out there cared enough to notice him. His eyes glistened with unshed tears as he sipped the coffee, his grip on the mug firm as though it were anchoring him. The quiet ripple of kindness didn't stop there. A woman at a nearby table, having overheard the exchange, called the waitress over. "Can I cover his dessert?" she asked softly, her cheeks flushed as if embarrassed by her own boldness. The waitress smiled and nodded, jotting it down. A man at the counter chimed in next. "Put a piece of pie on my tab," he said gruffly, avoiding eye contact but clearly moved by the moment. One by one, the diners in the small cafe began to chip in. Some offered to pay for part of his meal, while others quietly left extra tips for the waitress. The room was filled with a quiet hum of generosity, sparked by one small, anonymous gesture. Barron watched it all unfold, his heart swelling as he realized the impact of what had started as a simple act of kindness. He hadn't intended for anyone else to notice, but now the entire diner seemed to be part of something bigger, a shared moment of humanity and compassion. The man in the corner booth finally looked up, his eyes scanning the room. Who did this?" he asked softly, his voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear, but no one answered. The diners simply smiled or looked down at their plates, content to let the moment speak for itself. Barron's gaze remained steady on his tea. He didn't need to say anything. The man had his meal, the room was filled with warmth, and that was enough. But deep down, Barron couldn't help but wonder how far this ripple would spread, how many lives could be touched by one small act of kindness. As the man finished his meal, he sat quietly for a moment, holding the warm coffee mug between his hands. He looked around the diner again, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and confusion. "Whoever did this," he said softly, his voice breaking slightly, "I don't know how to thank you." His words hung in the air, drawing the attention of a few nearby patrons. A woman at the counter offered him a kind smile, while the young couple at the next table nodded in encouragement. Still, no one revealed the source of the generosity. The waitress returned, holding a small plate with a slice of pie. She set it down gently in front of him, her smile as warm as the dessert. "This one's on the house," she said softly. "Just a little something extra from the folks here." The man's eyes widened, and he blinked rapidly as if trying to hold back tears. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes people just want to help," she said simply. "Enjoy it. You deserve it." The man sat there for a long moment, staring down at the pie as if it were something far more meaningful than a dessert. He picked up the fork slowly, taking a small bite. His shoulders relaxed, and for the first time that evening, a faint smile appeared on his face. As the hum of the diner returned to its usual rhythm, a new sound cut through the quiet. A laugh. The man chuckled softly, shaking his head as he wiped his eyes. "It's funny," he said, mostly to himself, though a few nearby patrons leaned in to listen. "You spend so much time thinking no one notices you, that you're invisible." He set the fork down and looked up, his gaze sweeping the room. "But tonight, someone did, and it changes everything." His words carried a weight that seemed to settle over the room. People paused, reflecting on what he'd said, and even the chatter quieted for a moment. At his table, Barron felt a knot in his throat, but he kept his expression calm. This was the moment he'd hoped for. A reminder that even the smallest kindness could leave a lasting mark. Then the man did something unexpected. He stood up, clearing his throat to steady his voice. "I don't know who you are," he said, addressing the room, "but thank you. You didn't just buy me dinner. You reminded me that there are still good people in the world." The waitress, standing nearby, wiped her hands on her apron and smiled, her eyes glistening. The young couple at the next table clapped softly, and soon the whole diner joined in. A quiet, heartfelt applause that filled the room with warmth. The man sat back down, visibly moved, and for a moment there was nothing but silence between him and the plate in front of him. But then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather wallet. He opened it carefully, revealing a single photo, tucked inside, a picture of a younger man, smiling brightly, with his arm around an older woman. "This is my son," the man said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "He always used to do things like this. Told me the world could use more kindness." He ran his thumb over the photo, his eyes distant. "I lost him a few years ago, but tonight felt like he was here again." The room grew still, the weight of his story settling over everyone. Barron felt a chill run through him, his chest tightening at the man's words. It wasn't just about a meal anymore. It was about something deeper. Something that had connected everyone in the room in a way none of them had expected. The man took a deep breath, carefully placing the photo back in his wallet. "Whoever you are," he said again, his voice stronger now, "thank you. You've done more for me than you know." Barron watched quietly, his heart full but his expression calm. He hadn't intended for any of this to happen. It had started with a simple gesture, nothing more. But seeing the ripple effect, the way it touched not just the man but everyone in the diner, he realized just how powerful kindness could be. This wasn't just about a stranger's meal. It was about hope, about connection, and about the way even the smallest actions could bring people together in ways they never expected. And, as Barron sat there, listening to the soft hum of conversation returning to the diner, he couldn't help but feel that this moment would stay with him and everyone else in the room for a long, long time. The man sat back down, his expression softening as he gazed at the empty plate in front of him. The room had returned to its quiet rhythm, but there was a noticeable warmth in the air. People weren't just eating their meals or sipping their coffee anymore. They were looking at one another, sharing knowing smiles, as if they'd all been part of something special. His gaze settled on the young couple nearby, who offered him kind smiles. For a moment, he seemed hesitant, but then he spoke, his voice steady. "Thank you," he said again, addressing the room as a whole. "Not just to whoever paid for the meal, but to all of you. I didn't realize how much I needed this tonight, to feel seen." A few heads nodded, and one patron even clapped quietly, though the man quickly waved it off with a small chuckle. "I don't mean to make a fuss," he added, his voice softening, "but it's been a long time since I've felt like I wasn't invisible." His words struck a chord, rippling through the room like a quiet wave. At the counter, an older woman dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, while the waitress paused mid-step, her expression thoughtful. Even those who had been sitting in silence seemed to lean in, drawn to the quiet sincerity in his voice. Barron watched it all unfold, his chest tightening as he took in the scene. He hadn't expected this moment to touch so many people, but now it was clear. The ripple effect of kindness was larger than he could have imagined. The man glanced down at his wallet again, his fingers brushing over the worn leather. "I lost my son a few years ago," he said quietly, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearby. "He always told me to believe in the good in people, that even when things were tough, there was still kindness out there." He looked up, his eyes meeting those of the young couple, the waitress, and finally Barron, though he didn't seem to recognize him. "Tonight, you reminded me that he was right." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was filled with meaning, with a shared understanding that connected everyone in the room. For a brief moment, the diner wasn't just a place to grab a meal. It was a sanctuary, a space where strangers had become part of something bigger. As the man stood to leave, he turned to the waitress, his face calm but deeply grateful. "Thank you," he said simply, pressing her hand gently before walking toward the door. The young couple watched him go, their own expressions filled with quiet admiration. Barron remained at his seat, his hands wrapped around his mug of tea. The waitress leaned over, her voice low but warm. "You've done something special tonight," she said. "Not just for him, for all of us." Barron didn't respond immediately, his gaze lingering on the door where the man had just left. Finally, he looked up at her and smiled, a quiet but meaningful expression. "Sometimes, it's the smallest things," he said softly, "that make the biggest difference." The waitress nodded, her own eyes glistening. "You're right about that," she said, before walking back to the counter. And as the diner settled into the gentle hum of its evening routine, the memory of what had just happened lingered, a reminder to everyone that kindness, no matter how small, could change lives. This story is a powerful reminder of how a small act of kindness can create ripples far beyond what we might expect. For Barron, it was as simple as noticing someone in need and stepping in to help. He didn't do it for recognition or gratitude. He did it because it was the right thing to do. But what followed proved that compassion is contagious. The man in the diner wasn't just given a meal that night. He was reminded that even in difficult times, people care. He felt seen, valued, and connected in a way he hadn't in years. And his reaction didn't just affect him. It moved everyone who witnessed it. Strangers came together to contribute, to share in a moment of humanity, and to remind themselves of what really matters. In a world that often feels fast-paced and disconnected, It's easy to think that small gestures don't make a difference. But this story shows that they do. Whether it's paying for someone's meal, offering a kind word, or simply noticing someone who feels invisible, these moments of compassion can change lives, not just for the person receiving the kindness, but for everyone involved. It's a universal truth. Kindness inspires kindness. One small act can spark a chain reaction, touching hearts and reminding us all of the good that exists in the world. We don't have to move mountains to make a difference. Sometimes, it's as simple as stopping to care, to listen, or to help. So as you go about your day, remember this: the smallest actions often leave the biggest impact. You have the power to make someone's day a little brighter, and in doing so, you might just create a moment that inspires others to do the same. After all, kindness is a gift we can all afford to give, and its effects are priceless. If this story moved you, take a moment to share it with someone who might need a little reminder about the power of kindness. Let's spread the message that even the smallest acts can make a huge difference. Don't forget to like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming stories that inspire hope and connection. Together, we can make kindness go even further.